Some losses never heal, they just teach you to live with the pain. Widow May learned this the hard way when her husband died under a bull's hooves, leaving her alone with anger and a ranch full of memories. Now she keeps that same bull and throws the same challenge at every cowboy who drifts through town. Call yourself a cowboy? Then tame this bull. They all try, they all fail. When old Jed Waller shows up 60 years old, broke, and worn down by life, May gives him the same dare. Nobody thinks this tired drifter has a chance against the beast that's broken every other man. But sometimes the most beaten down folks have the most fight left in them. What happens when a man with nothing left to lose faces a bull that's never been beaten? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The town of Esperanza sat like a forgotten prayer in the high desert of New Mexico, where the wind carried more dust than hope and the sun beat down on adobe walls that had seen better decades. Once, cattle drives had thundered through these streets, filling the saloons with laughter and the general store with silver dollars. Now, in the autumn of 1893, tumbleweeds outnumbered visitors, and most folks spent their evenings wondering if tomorrow would bring the final nail in their town's coffin. Jed Waller rode into this dying place on a horse as weathered as himself, leading a pack mule that carried everything he owned in the world. His worn saddle, hand-tooled leather, cracked and faded but still functional, told the story of better days when crowds had cheered his name from rodeo stands across the territory. Now the saddle bore the scars of hard miles and harder years, much like the man who sat in it. At 60, Jed had the kind of face that spoke of experience earned through loss. Deep lines mapped the geography of disappointment around his grey eyes, and his hands showed the permanent bend of decades gripping reins and rope. His clothes were clean but patched, his boots resoled more times than pride should allow. Yet there was something in his Beringa quiet dignity that poverty couldn't quite break, that made people look twice when he passed. The saloon keeper, Tom Brennan, watched from his doorway as Jed tied his horse to the hitching post. Tom had seen plenty of drifters come through Esparanza, most running from something or toward trouble. This one seemed different. Maybe it was the way he spoke gently to his horse, or how he checked the animal's hooves before tending to his own needs. In Tom's experience, you could tell a man's character by how he treated creatures that couldn't fight back. "Stranger," Tom called out, wiping his hands on his apron. "You look like you could use a drink and maybe some information about the territory." Jed nodded respectfully, the gesture of a man raised to acknowledge kindness. "Much obliged." "Name's Jed Waller." His voice carried the quiet authority of someone who'd learned that shouting rarely solved problems. "Tom Brennan. I run the only watering hole left in this town that serves more than regret." Tom gestured toward the saloon's interior, where a handful of local ranchers nursed their afternoon whiskey. "What brings you to Esperanza? Most folks these days are heading the other direction." "Looking for honest work," Jed replied, settling onto a bar stool that had been worn smooth by countless elbows. "Heard there might be ranches hereabouts that could use an experienced hand." Tom poured a whiskey, noting how Jed's eyes assessed the amber liquid's quality before taking a measured sip. Not a desperate man, then, despite his obvious poverty. "There's work to be had, but it depends on what kind of experience you're talking about. You handle cattle, horses, or are you one of those fellows who thinks riding a bull makes him a cowboy?" The question hung in the air like smoke, and several conversations in the saloon quieted. Jed sensed he'd stumbled into local territory, the kind of sensitive ground that could define a man's welcome in a small town. "I've done my share of bull riding," Jed admitted quietly. "Long time ago. These days, I'm more interested in work that doesn't require getting thrown around for entertainment." A rancher at the far end of the bar let out a bitter laugh. "Well, you picked the right town for avoiding bull riding, friend, unless you're fool enough to tangle with Widow May's devil." Tom shot the rancher a warning look, but the damage was done. Jed's curiosity was clearly piqued, and in Esperanza, once a story started telling, it had to run its course. "Widow May Carson," Tom explained reluctantly. Owns the biggest spread left in these parts. Lost her husband 3 years back when he tried to ride a bull called Lucifer. Mean beast, black as midnight and twice as unforgiving. Ever since then, May's had this challenge she throws at every cowboy who comes through town. What kind of challenge? Jed asked, though something in his tone suggested he already suspected. 8 seconds on Lucifer's back, another voice chimed in. This came from Sheriff Martinez, a weathered man whose badge looked as tired as everything else in Esperanza. May's got herself convinced that any man worth the name Cowboy should be able to do what her husband couldn't. Been through maybe 20 challenges in 3 years. Lucifer's bucked off every last one. And Widow Carson, what's she like? Jed's question carried more than casual interest. Tom considered his words carefully. May Carson was a complicated subject in Esperanza, equally respected and pitied. She's a good woman carrying a heavy load of grief, smart as a whip, tougher than most men, and prettier than any widow has a right to be. But that bull took more than her husband took her ability to trust that anything good might last. The saloon fell quiet except for the tick of an old clock and the distant sound of wind through the gaps in the building's weathered boards. Each man present had his own thoughts about May Carson and her impossible challenge, but few had the courage to voice them. "Where might I find this Widow Carson?" Jed asked finally. Tom's expression grew concerned. "Now hold on there, friend. I wasn't telling that story to send you off on some fool's errand. May's challenge isn't a job opportunity. It's a way for a broken woman to prove that every man will disappoint her eventually." "Maybe so," Jed replied, finishing his whiskey. "But a man's got to start somewhere when he's looking for work. How do I find her ranch?" Despite his misgivings, Tom provided directions to the Carson spread. As Jed prepared to leave, the sheriff caught his arm gently. "Listen, Waller, I don't know your story, and I'm not asking. But May Carson's been through enough pain without watching another man get broken trying to prove something that can't be proved. That bull isn't just mean, it's smart. It knows how to hurt people." Jed nodded respectfully. "I appreciate the warning, Sheriff, but sometimes a man finds exactly what he's looking for in the last place anyone expects him to look." As Jed rode out of town toward the Carson ranch, the men in the saloon exchanged glances filled with equal parts admiration and pity. They'd seen this story before, or thought they had. An aging cowboy, past his prime and desperate to prove something to himself and the world. It usually ended with broken bones and wounded pride. But Tom Brennan, watching through the saloon's dusty window as Jed's figure grew smaller against the vast landscape, found himself wondering if maybe this time might be different. There had been something in the man's eyes, not the reckless fire of youth or the desperate hunger of failure, but something quieter and more dangerous. The patient determination of a man who'd already lost everything that mattered and discovered he was still breathing. The Carson ranch sat in a valley where the grass grew green despite the high desert's harsh demands, fed by a spring that had drawn May's husband to this land 15 years earlier. The house was adobe and timber, built to last generations, with a wide porch that faced the sunset and corrals that could hold 100 head of cattle. It was a place designed for family, for children's laughter and Sunday dinners, for the kind of life that required 2 people working toward the same dream. Now it felt too big for one woman, no matter how determined she was, to fill every corner with work and worry. May Carson stood on that porch as Jed approached, her dark hair pulled back severely and her dress practical rather than pretty. At 35, she retained the kind of beauty that came from good bones and character, but 3 years of grief and anger had carved hard lines around her eyes and mouth. Her wedding ring caught the afternoon light, a simple gold band she still wore like armor against the possibility of hope. She watched Jed dismount and approach, with the careful assessment of a woman who'd learned to judge men by their intentions rather than their words. His respectful distance, the way he waited for permission to approach her porch, the gentle handling of his horse, these details registered in her mind like evidence in a trial where she was both judge and jury. "Ma'am," Jed said, removing his hat and holding it respectfully, "I'm Jed Waller. I understand you might have work for an experienced ranch hand." May's laugh held no warmth. Work, is that what you call it? Let me guess. Tom Brennan filled your ears with tales about my challenge, and now you're here to prove you're man enough to ride what my husband couldn't. I'm here looking for honest work, Jed replied evenly. If you've got a challenge, I'm willing to listen, but I'm not here to prove anything except that I can earn my keep. Something in his tone made May study him more carefully. Most men who came to her ranch arrived full of bluster and bravado, eager to show off for the grieving widow. This one spoke like a man who understood the difference between confidence and arrogance. You know anything about cattle? She asked. Yes, ma'am. Horses too. Been working ranches since I was 12 years old. And bull riding? A shadow crossed Jed's weathered features. I've done my share, won some competitions, back when winning mattered to me. May felt a familiar stirring of the anger that had sustained her through 3 years of loneliness. Another aging cowboy, convinced he could succeed where younger, stronger men had failed. The pattern was as predictable as sunrise. Call yourself a cowboy, she said, her voice sharp with practiced mockery, then tame this bull. The words hung between them like a challenge thrown down in the dust. Jed studied her face, seeing past the anger to the pain that drove it. When he spoke, his voice was gentle enough to surprise them both. Ma'am, I can see you've got reasons for that challenge that go deeper than testing cowboys. If you want me to try riding your bull, I'll do it. But not to prove I'm a man, and not to show off for you or anybody else. If I ride him, it'll be because you need me to. May felt her carefully constructed walls shiver. In 3 years, no one had spoken to her with such quiet understanding. Most men saw her challenge as an opportunity for glory. This one seemed to see it for what it truly was, a woman's desperate attempt to make sense of senseless loss. The bull's name is Lucifer, she said finally. He's killed 1 man and injured 19 others. If you're fool enough to climb on his back, you do it knowing you might not walk away. Jed nodded solemnly. When? 3 days from now. That'll give you time to see what you're up against and maybe come to your senses. May turned toward her front door, then paused. There's a bunkhouse you can use. Pays $2 a day if you survive the week, regardless of whether you ride the bull or not. As May disappeared into her house, Jed stood in the gathering dusk and felt the weight of destiny settling on his shoulders like a familiar coat. He'd come to Esperanza looking for work, but he suspected he'd found something much more complicated and far more important. In the distance, from the direction of the corrals, came the sound that had haunted May Carson's dreams for 3 years, the low, rumbling challenge of a bull that had never been conquered, calling across the desert like a voice from the grave. The morning sun painted the Carson ranch in shades of gold and amber as Jed made his way to the corrals, moving with the deliberate pace of a man who'd learned that rushing rarely improved outcomes. He'd spent a restless night in the bunkhouse, not from fear of the challenge ahead, but from memories that had stirred like dust devils in his mind, memories he'd spent 5 years trying to bury beneath miles of wandering and hard work. May was already up, as he'd expected. Through the kitchen window, he could see her silhouette moving with the efficient grace of a woman who'd learned to do the work of 2 people. She emerged onto the porch, carrying a cup of coffee, her hair still loose from sleep, but her eyes already sharp with the alertness of someone perpetually braced for disappointment. "You're up early for a man about to risk his neck," she called out, her tone carrying the same edge it had held the day before. "Habit," Jed replied, touching the brim of his hat respectfully. "Mind if I take a look at your bull before the whole town shows up to watch?" May studied him over the rim of her coffee cup. Most men wanted an audience for their moment of glory or humiliation. This request for privacy intrigued her despite her determination to remain unmoved by anything he might do or say. "Help yourself," she said. "Just don't blame me if he decides to introduce himself through the fence." Jed walked toward the largest corral, where a structure built of timber and steel stood like a fortress against the morning sky. The fencing was higher and stronger than anything needed for cattle, reinforced with crossbeams that spoke of hard-learned lessons about the creature it contained. Then he saw Lucifer. The bull was magnificent and terrible, a creature that seemed carved from midnight itself. Standing nearly 6 feet at the shoulder and weighing close to 2,000 pounds, he was raw power given form and consciousness. His hide was so black it seemed to absorb light, broken only by a white star on his forehead that looked like a target painted by the devil himself. His horns curved forward with surgical precision, and his eyes held an intelligence that was somehow more unsettling than simple animal rage. But it was the way Lucifer carried himself that truly impressed and concerned Jed. This wasn't a mindless brute driven by instinct. This was a thinking opponent who'd learned to read men's fears and exploit their weaknesses. The bull stood perfectly still, watching Jed with the patient attention of a predator studying potential prey. "He knows you're here." May's voice came from behind him. She'd approached silently, carrying the challenge rope that had become as much a part of the ritual as the bull himself. The frayed lasso had belonged to her husband, and she used it to bind each challenger to their fate literally and symbolically. "How many men has he thrown?" Jed asked quietly. 23, counting my husband." May's voice carried the weight of each failure. "The lucky ones walked away with bruises and wounded pride. The unlucky ones spent weeks healing broken bones. My husband was the unluckiest of all." Jed studied the rope in her hands, noting the wear patterns and the careful mending that kept it functional despite its age. "Tell me about that day." May's composure faltered for just a moment, revealing the raw grief that still lived beneath her carefully maintained anger. "Robert was sure he could break Lucifer. Said the bull just needed to understand who was boss. He went in there like he was going to war, all fire and determination. And Lucifer threw him in 6 seconds. Robert landed wrong, and the bull came down on him before anyone could get between them." May's voice grew distant, as if she were watching the scene replay in her mind. "The doctor said he died instantly, but I keep thinking that if he'd just approached it differently, if he'd been more patient instead of trying to dominate." "Ma'am," Jed interrupted gently, "can I tell you something about my son?" The unexpected question caught May off guard. She'd assumed, like everyone else who'd heard whispers about the quiet stranger, that Jed was just another aging cowboy chasing past glory. The mention of a son changed the entire context of their conversation. "His name was Michael," Jed continued, his eyes still fixed on Lucifer. "Finest rider I ever trained, and I'm not just saying that because he was my blood. Kid had hands soft as silk and a seat that looked like he'd been born in the saddle." May found herself drawn into the story, despite her instinct to maintain emotional distance. There was something in Jed's voice, a familiar pain that recognized and respected her own. "We were at a rodeo in Colorado 5 years back. Michael was riding a bull called Tornado, mean but not evil, just a working bull doing his job. The ride was going perfect. Michael had him measured and balanced, moving like they were dancing instead of fighting." Jed paused, and May saw his hands tighten slightly on the fence rail. But then Michael decided to show off a little, tried to ride one, handed for the crowd, probably wanted to impress some girl in the stands. Lost his balance for just a second, and that was all it took. Tornado threw him, and Michael hit the fence post wrong, broke his neck clean. The words hung in the desert air like heat shimmers, distorting everything around them. May felt her own grief responding to his, recognizing a kindred spirit in loss and regret. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I blamed myself for years," Jed continued. "Thought if I'd taught him better, if I'd made him more careful instead of more confident, he'd still be alive. Spent 5 years wandering around, trying to find something that would make the guilt stop eating at me from the inside. Did you find it?" Jed turned to look at her directly for the first time since beginning his story. "I found something better. I found understanding. Michael didn't die because I failed to teach him right. He died because sometimes bad things happen to good people, and all the skill and preparation in the world can't change that." May felt tears threatening, the first she'd allowed herself in months. "Then why are you here? Why risk riding another bull when you know how it can end?" "Because," Jed said quietly, "I also learned that running from fear doesn't make it smaller. It just makes you smaller. Your husband didn't die because he wasn't good enough. He died because he was human, and humans make mistakes, but that doesn't mean the trying was wrong. May stared at him, seeing for the first time not just another challenger, but a man who understood the weight of loss and the courage required to keep living despite it. The anger she'd nursed for 3 years felt suddenly heavy and unnecessary, like armor that had become too cumbersome to carry. "You don't have to do this," she said. "I can see you're not like the others. You're not here to prove anything or show off. You could just work the ranch, and we could forget about the challenge." Jed smiled, and the expression transformed his weathered features completely. "Ma'am, I appreciate that more than you know, but I didn't come here to run from another challenge. I came here to finally stop running." By mid-morning, word had spread through Esperanza that the stranger was actually going through with May's challenge. People began arriving at the Carson Ranch in wagons and on horseback, drawn by the same mixture of hope and morbid curiosity that had attended every previous attempt. They gathered along the fence like spectators at a hanging, their faces showing the wear of people who'd seen too many dreams broken against hard reality. Tom Brennan arrived with Sheriff Martinez, both men wearing expressions of resigned concern. They'd tried to talk sense into more than one challenger over the years, and they'd learned that men who'd made up their minds to ride Lucifer rarely listened to reason. "You sure about this, Jed?" Tom called out, as Jed checked his gear one final time. "As sure as a man can be about anything in this world," Jed replied. May stood holding the challenge rope, her hands trembling slightly despite her efforts to maintain composure. The ritual had become automatic over the years: bind the rider's hand to the rope, open the gate, and watch another man's confidence crumble under the fury of an unbeaten bull. But this time felt different. This time, she found herself hoping for something she'd convinced herself was impossible, that someone might actually succeed where her husband had failed. "Before I climb on that bull," Jed said, loud enough for the gathered crowd to hear, "I want everyone here to understand something. If I get hurt today, it's not because the bull is evil or because Widow Carson's challenge is unfair. It's because sometimes a man has to test himself against something bigger than he is, just to see what he's made of." He took the rope from May's hands, noting how her fingers lingered against his for just a moment longer than necessary. "If I succeed," he continued, "it won't be because I'm better than the men who came before me. It'll be because sometimes understanding works better than force, and patience works better than anger." Lucifer watched these preparations with the focused attention of a creature that had learned to read human intentions. As Jed approached the gate, the bull shifted slightly, muscles rippling beneath his midnight hide like storm clouds gathering on the horizon. The challenge that had defined Esperanza for 3 years was about to reach its moment of truth, and everyone present, including the bull, seemed to understand that this time would be different, one way or another. The crowd fell silent as Jed approached the gate, but instead of the dramatic moment they expected, he simply stopped and studied Lucifer with the patient attention of a man reading a difficult book. The bull regarded him with equal intensity, and for several long minutes neither man nor beast moved. "What's he waiting for?" someone whispered from the fence. May found herself holding her breath, watching this strange dance of assessment between the aging cowboy and the creature that had haunted her dreams. Every other challenger had rushed toward their moment of truth, eager to prove themselves before courage could desert them. Jed seemed content to wait until something invisible shifted between him and the bull. Finally, Jed stepped back from the gate and turned to address the crowd. "Folks, I appreciate you coming out to watch, but I'm going to ask you to head home for today. This bull and I need to get acquainted properly before we dance together." Murmurs of disappointment rippled through the gathered spectators. They'd come expecting drama, and instead they were being dismissed like children sent to bed early. "Now hold on," called out Buck Patterson, a local rancher whose own failed attempt at riding Lucifer had left him with a permanent limp. "We didn't ride all the way out here just to watch you stare at that bull." Jed's response was respectful but firm. "I understand your disappointment, Mr. Patterson, but I've learned that the most important part of any job happens before the work begins. If you want to see me ride that bull, you'll get your chance. But first, he and I need to reach an understanding." May surprised herself by supporting Jed's request. "You heard him, folks. The show's postponed, not cancelled. Come back in 3 days, and you'll see something worth your time." As the crowd reluctantly dispersed, May lingered by the corral, curious about this man who seemed to approach everything differently than she expected. Jed had returned to his quiet observation of Lucifer, and she could see that whatever was happening between them was more complex than simple preparation. "What exactly are you looking for?" she asked. "Trying to understand what makes him angry," Jed replied, without taking his eyes off the bull. "Every animal that fights has a reason. Sometimes it's fear, sometimes it's pain, sometimes it's just bad treatment. But there's always a reason." May felt a flicker of irritation. "He's angry because he's a bull. It's what they do." "No, Mom. Bulls can be gentle as lambs if they're treated right. This one's different. He's got something eating at him from the inside, same as people do when they've been hurt too deep for healing." The observation struck May like a physical blow. She'd spent 3 years telling herself that Lucifer was simply a mean animal, a force of nature that had taken her husband through no fault of anyone's. The possibility that the bull might be suffering, might be acting out of pain rather than malice, had never occurred to her. "You think he's in pain?" "I think he's angry about something that happened to him before your husband ever climbed on his back. Look at the way he favors his left side when he moves. See how he keeps his head tilted just slightly? Something hurt him once, and he's been taking it out on every man who's tried to ride him since." May studied Lucifer with new eyes, seeing details she'd missed in 3 years of daily encounters. The bull did indeed show signs of old injury, subtle compensations in his movement that spoke of pain managed rather than healed. "If you're right," she said slowly, "then what my husband faced wasn't just a mean bull. It was a creature in constant pain, fighting back the only way he knew how." "Maybe so. And if that's true, then beating him isn't the answer. Understanding him might be." That afternoon, while May tended to ranch business, Jed made himself useful around the property. His first stop was the widow Henderson's place, a small homestead on the edge of town, where 80-year-old Sarah Henderson lived alone, with a roof that leaked worse every time it rained. Jed climbed onto that roof, with the careful movements of a man who understood that a fall at his age could be his last. For 3 hours, he worked in the desert sun, replacing rotted boards and sealing gaps that had let in weather and worry for 2 long years. "I can't pay you much," Sarah called up from her porch, her voice thin with age and concern. "Didn't ask for payment," Jed replied, "just doing what needs doing." When the work was finished, Sarah insisted on feeding him lunch and over plates of beans and cornbread. She told him about her late husband's service in the war, about the children who'd moved east for better opportunities, about the loneliness that filled a house where love used to live. "You're a good man, Jed Waller," she said as he prepared to leave. "Don't let that bull change that, no matter what happens." News of Jed's good deeds spread through Esperanza faster than wildfire. By evening, half the town was talking about the stranger who'd fixed Sarah Henderson's roof without being asked, who'd refused payment, and who'd listened to an old woman's stories with the patience of a grandson. May heard the stories when she rode into town for supplies, and each telling added another layer to her growing confusion about this man who'd wandered into her life. Cowboys who came to ride Lucifer usually spent their waiting time drinking, bragging, or trying to charm her into bed. None of them had ever spent their afternoon doing charity work for elderly widows. "That man of yours has got the whole town talking," Tom Brennan told her as she picked up feed for her horses. "He's not my man," May replied quickly, but the words felt strange in her mouth. "Well, whatever he is, he's got folks thinking maybe this time might be different. Sarah Henderson's been praying for him every night since he fixed her roof, and you know the Lord pays special attention to old ladies' prayers." May carried those words home with her, along with a growing sense that Jed Waller represented something she'd convinced herself no longer existed. The possibility that men could be genuinely good without expecting anything in return. That evening, she found him sitting on the bunkhouse steps, carefully examining a faded photograph by lamplight. The image showed a younger Jed with his arm around a boy who shared his eyes and smile, both of them grinning at the camera with the easy confidence of people who believed the future held nothing but good things. "Your son?" May asked softly. Jed nodded, his thumb tracing the edge of the photograph with the gentle touch of a man handling something infinitely precious. "Michael. This was taken the day before he died. We'd just won the team roping competition at the Denver Rodeo, and he was so proud he could barely contain himself." May sat down beside him, close enough to see the love and loss written in every line of his weathered face. "He looks like he was a fine boy." "He was everything I hoped to be when I grew up," Jed replied. "Brave without being foolish, strong without being cruel, confident without being arrogant. I used to think I was teaching him to be a man, but looking back, I think he was teaching me what a man should be." They sat in comfortable silence as the desert night settled around them. Two people who'd learned that grief shared was somehow lighter than grief carried alone. Above them, stars wheeled across the vast New Mexico sky, and in the distance, Lucifer's occasional snorts and movements reminded them that some challenges couldn't be postponed forever. But for this moment, in the quiet understanding that flowed between them, both May and Jed felt something they'd thought was lost forever. The possibility that healing might be more than just learning to live with pain. The second day of Jed's preparation dawned clear and cool, with the kind of crisp desert air that made everything seem possible. May woke to find him already at Lucifer's corral, not watching this time but working nearby, mending a section of fence that had been damaged in the bull's last encounter with a challenger. What struck her wasn't just his industry, but his method. Instead of the quick, loud repairs most ranch hands would make, Jed worked with deliberate quiet, his hammer strikes measured and his movements calm. He seemed to understand that everything he did near Lucifer was a form of communication, a way of establishing trust or at least reducing hostility. "Morning," May called softly as she approached with 2 cups of coffee. "Much obliged," Jed replied, accepting the cup with hands that showed the calluses of honest work. "Your bull's been watching me work for the past hour. I think he's trying to decide whether I'm a threat or just another ranch hand." May studied Lucifer, noting that the massive animal was indeed focused on Jed, with an intensity that seemed different from his usual hostile alertness. "What do you think he's decided?" "Nothing yet, but he's not trying to charge the fence anymore when I get close. That's progress." In the kitchen window of the main house, May kept her husband's silver spurs displayed like a shrine. They were beautiful pieces, intricately engraved with patterns that caught the morning light and threw it back in dancing reflections. She'd polished them every week since Robert's death, maintaining them in perfect condition, as if he might return at any moment to claim them. But as she watched Jed's patient approach to Lucifer, May found herself questioning the wisdom of preserving the past so perfectly. Perhaps some things were meant to be used rather than worshipped, lived with rather than grieved over. "Tell me about your husband," Jed said as they stood together by the fence. "What was he like when he wasn't trying to prove himself?" The question caught May off guard. Most people who asked about Robert wanted to hear about his death, about the dramatic confrontation with Lucifer. No one had asked about the man he'd been in life. "He was gentle," she said after a moment's consideration. "Patient with animals, kind to people who couldn't help him, generous with what we had. He made me laugh every single day for 12 years. Sounds like a good man." He was, but he had this need to prove himself, especially after we'd been trying for children without success. I think he felt like less of a man because he couldn't give me a family, and that made him take risks he shouldn't have taken. Jed nodded with the understanding of someone who'd struggled with similar demons. Grief makes men do foolish things sometimes. We get so caught up in what we think we should be that we forget to appreciate what we are. Before May could respond, the sound of approaching horses interrupted their conversation. A small group of riders was approaching the ranch, led by a man whose expensive clothes and arrogant bearing marked him as someone accustomed to getting his way through wealth rather than merit. "Clayton Burke," May muttered, her voice carrying the same tone she might use to announce an outbreak of plague. Clayton Burke owned the largest spread in the territory, a ranch that had grown through aggressive acquisition of failing properties and questionable business practices. He was handsome in the way that money could make a man handsome, well-dressed, well-fed, and supremely confident in his ability to buy whatever he wanted. "May, darling," Clayton called out as he dismounted, his tone carrying the casual possessiveness of a man who considered her property he hadn't yet acquired. "I heard you've got another challenger for that devil bull of yours." "Mr. Burke," May replied coolly, "what brings you to my ranch uninvited?" "Concern for your welfare, naturally. I've been hearing stories about this drifter you've taken in, and I thought it was time we had a conversation about your future security." Jed stepped slightly forward, not aggressively but with the quiet authority of a man marking his territory. Clayton noticed the movement and assessed Jed with the calculating gaze of someone evaluating a potential threat. "You must be the famous bull rider," Clayton said, his smile sharp enough to cut glass. "Clayton Burke. I own most of the land between here and the Colorado border." "Jed Waller," came the simple reply. "I work for Mrs. Carson. Temporarily, I'm sure. Men like you tend to drift through these parts pretty regularly, leaving broken bones and broken promises behind." Clayton's attention returned to May. "Which is why I'm here to renew my offer of marriage, May. You need a man who can provide stability, protection, and the kind of future this ranch deserves." May's cheeks flushed with anger. "Mr. Burke, I've told you repeatedly that I'm not interested in your proposal. My answer hasn't changed." "Perhaps not, but your circumstances have. This ranch is struggling, May. You're running cattle on land that could support twice the herd with proper management and investment. You're trying to do the work of 3 men, and it's showing." "The ranch is doing fine," May replied, but Jed could hear the uncertainty in her voice. Clayton pressed his advantage. "Is it? When's the last time you turned a real profit? When's the last time you were able to make improvements instead of just maintaining what's already here? You're a beautiful woman, May, but beauty doesn't balance books or build futures." "And what about my challenge?" May asked, her voice gaining strength. "Are you planning to ride Lucifer yourself, Mr. Burke? Prove you're man enough to deserve what you're trying to buy?" Clayton's laugh was genuinely amused. "May, darling, I'm a businessman, not a fool. I have no interest in risking my neck on that devil. But I am interested in discussing what happens to this ranch when your current employee joins the list of men that Bull has broken." "That's enough," Jed said quietly, but his words carried the kind of authority that made everyone present take notice. "Mrs. Carson has given you her answer, Mr. Burke. Seems to me a gentleman would respect that and be on his way." Clayton's expression hardened. "I don't believe anyone asked for your opinion, Drifter. This is a conversation between property owners." "Maybe so, but it's taking place on Mrs. Carson's property, and she's made it clear you're not welcome here." The tension between the 2 men was palpable, and May found herself caught between fear and admiration. She'd grown tired of Clayton's persistent proposals, but she'd never had anyone stand up to him on her behalf. "This isn't over, May," Clayton said as he remounted his horse. "You can't keep hiding behind charity cases and impossible challenges forever. Sooner or later, you're going to have to face reality." As Clayton and his men rode away, May felt a mixture of gratitude and concern. Jed had defended her honor, but in doing so, he'd also made an enemy of the most powerful man in the territory. "You didn't have to do that," she said softly. "Yes, I did," Jed replied. "A man who won't stand up for what's right when it matters probably won't stand up for anything when it counts." That evening, as they worked together to repair a water trough that had sprung a leak, May found herself stealing glances at Jed's hands. They were strong hands, scarred by work and weather, but gentle when gentleness was needed. She'd forgotten what it felt like to work alongside someone who didn't need to dominate every situation, who could be strong without being cruel. "Jed," she said as they finished their work. "Whatever happens with Lucifer, I want you to know that having you here has meant more to me than you probably realize." He looked at her directly, and she saw something in his eyes that made her breath catch, not the predatory interest she'd grown accustomed to from men, but something deeper and more patient. "May," he said quietly, "I've been wandering for 5 years, looking for a place where I could stop running from my ghosts. I think I might have found it." Above them, the first stars were beginning to appear in the vast New Mexico sky, and somewhere in the darkness, Lucifer moved restlessly in his corral, as if sensing that the careful balance of his world was about to change forever. On the third morning, May found herself drawn to a trunk in her bedroom that she hadn't opened since the week after Robert's funeral. Inside, wrapped in faded tissue paper, lay a hand-carved wooden horse, no bigger than her palm. Robert had spent months crafting it during their second year of marriage, when they'd still believed children were simply a matter of time and patience. The little horse was perfect in every detail, from its flowing mane to its prancing pose, carved with the loving attention of a man preparing for fatherhood. Robert had made it for the son or daughter they'd planned to have, the child who would carry on their name and fill their house with laughter. Now it sat in May's hands like a monument to dreams that had died before they could be born, and she found herself thinking about the future in ways she hadn't allowed herself to consider since Robert's death. Outside her window, she could see Jed working with quiet determination to prepare for the challenge that was now only hours away. He'd begun actual physical training, and watching him move revealed the ghost of the champion he'd once been. His body still remembered the balance and timing that had made him famous, even if age and hard living had stolen some of his strength. May dressed carefully that morning, choosing a blue dress that Robert had always said brought out her eyes. She told herself it was simply a matter of dressing appropriately for what might be the most important day the ranch had seen in 3 years. But the truth was more complicated. She wanted to look beautiful for Jed, wanted him to see her as more than just a bitter widow clinging to impossible challenges. When she emerged from the house, she found Jed sitting on the corral fence, having what appeared to be a serious conversation with Lucifer. The bull stood close to the fence, his massive head tilted, as if listening to words May couldn't quite hear from her distance. "What are you telling him?" she asked as she approached. "Same thing I used to tell Michael before a difficult ride." Jed replied without turning around. "That we're partners in this dance, not enemies. That I respect his power, and I hope he'll respect my intentions." May climbed up beside him on the fence, close enough to feel the warmth radiating from his body in the cool morning air. "And what are your intentions?" "To prove that understanding can triumph over force. To show that patience is stronger than anger. And maybe—" He paused, looking at her with an expression that made her heart race. "To prove that second chances are possible, even for people who thought they'd used up all their chances." Before May could respond to the clear meaning in his words, the sound of approaching riders interrupted the moment. But this time, it wasn't Clayton Burke and his men. Instead, nearly the entire population of Esperanza was converging on the Carson Ranch, drawn by word that today would finally see the resolution of the challenge that had defined their community for 3 years. Tom Brennan arrived first, followed by Sheriff Martinez and what seemed like every rancher, shopkeeper, and citizen within a day's ride. They came on horseback and in wagons, bringing their families and their hopes for something that might restore their faith in the possibility of triumph over impossible odds. "Looks like you've got yourself an audience," May observed. "Good," Jed replied, surprising her. "Some things are worth witnessing, and some victories are meant to be shared." As the crowd gathered, May noticed how differently they looked at Jed compared to previous challengers. There was respect in their faces, the kind of regard earned through character rather than bravado. Sarah Henderson had brought a special quilt to sit on, positioning herself where she could see everything clearly while maintaining a steady stream of what May suspected were fervent prayers. "Before we begin," Jed announced to the assembled crowd, "I want everyone here to understand what they're about to witness. This isn't about conquering or breaking anything. This is about finding common ground between two living creatures who've both been hurt by life. He gestured toward Lucifer, who stood in the center of the corral like a black mountain, every muscle tensed with anticipation. This bull isn't evil, and he's not my enemy. He's a creature in pain, striking out at a world that's caused him suffering. My job isn't to defeat him, it's to help him remember that not all humans mean him harm. May felt tears threatening as she listened to Jed's words. In 3 years, no one had ever spoken about Lucifer with such compassion, such understanding of the pain that drove his fury. The bull had become a symbol of everything that had gone wrong in her life, and she'd never considered that he might be suffering just as much as she was. "And if I fail today," Jed continued, his voice carrying clearly over the desert air, "it won't be because I wasn't strong enough or brave enough. It'll be because some bridges can't be rebuilt, some trust can't be restored. But that doesn't mean the trying was worthless." Clayton Burke arrived just as Jed finished speaking, his expensive clothes and arrogant demeanor creating a stark contrast to the working people who'd come to witness the challenge. He positioned himself prominently near the fence, his expression making it clear that he expected to see Jed's failure and May's subsequent surrender to his marriage proposal. "Touching speech," Clayton called out loudly enough for everyone to hear. "But speeches don't ride bulls, old man. Actions do." Jed nodded respectfully. "You're absolutely right, Mr. Burke, which is why I'm not going to waste any more words." May watched as Jed began his final preparations, checking his rope and adjusting his worn boots with the methodical attention of a man who understood that details could mean the difference between success and disaster. His movements were calm and purposeful, showing none of the nervous energy that had characterized previous challenges. "May," he said quietly, drawing her aside for a private moment, "whatever happens in there, I want you to know that meeting you has given me something I thought I'd lost forever." "What's that?" "A reason to believe that love is stronger than loss, that hope is stronger than grief, and that some things are worth risking everything to protect." Before she could respond, he leaned forward and kissed her gently, a kiss that tasted of promise and possibility, and all the dreams they'd both thought were dead and buried. When they separated, May saw in his eyes the reflection of her own hope that maybe, just maybe, this time could be different. "Now," Jed said with a smile that transformed his weathered features completely, "let's see if this old cowboy can still dance." As he walked toward the gate where Lucifer waited, May found herself holding the wooden horse so tightly that its carved edges left marks in her palm. Around her, the crowd fell silent with the kind of reverent attention usually reserved for church services or wedding ceremonies. The challenge that had defined 3 years of grief and anger was about to reach its moment of truth, and everyone present seemed to understand that they were witnessing something far more significant than a simple test of man against beast. The sun climbed higher as the crowd settled into position around the corral, their faces showing the mixture of hope and apprehension that accompanies any moment when dreams might either soar or shatter. May stood at the fence, her hands gripping the wooden rails so tightly her knuckles had gone white, the carved horse tucked safely in her dress pocket where she could feel its small weight against her heart. Clayton Burke positioned himself directly across from her, his expression confident and predatory. He'd been courting May for 2 years, ever since a decent interval after Robert's death had passed, and he clearly expected today's inevitable failure to finally convince her that marriage to him was her only reasonable option. "May, darling," Clayton called across the corral, his voice carrying false sympathy, "it's not too late to call this off. No one would think less of you for sparing this poor old fool the humiliation." "I think you're the only one here who's worried about humiliation, Mr. Burke," May replied, her voice stronger than she felt. Jed heard the exchange, but didn't react beyond a slight tightening around his eyes. He'd finished his preparations and now stood beside the gate, studying Lucifer with the patient attention of a man about to enter into partnership with a force of nature. The bull was magnificent in the afternoon light, his black hide gleaming like polished obsidian and his massive frame radiating power that was both beautiful and terrible. But May found herself looking past the obvious danger to see what Jed had been trying to show her: the slight favor of Lucifer's left side, the way his head tilted to compensate for some old injury, the intelligence in his dark eyes that spoke of a creature capable of more than simple rage. In her bedroom, she kept a memento from the day Lucifer had killed her husband, a piece of the bull's horn that had broken off during the fatal encounter. She'd preserved it like a relic, a reminder of the moment her world had ended. But now she found herself wondering if she'd been wrong to see it as a symbol of malevolence. Perhaps it was simply evidence of a creature that had been hurt and was striking back at a world that seemed determined to cause him pain. "Jed," May called softly, and he turned to look at her with those grey eyes that had become so dear to her in such a short time. "I need to tell you something." He approached the fence where she stood, moving close enough that she could speak without the crowd overhearing. "The day Robert died," she whispered, "wasn't the first time he'd tried to ride Lucifer. He'd been making attempts for weeks, each one ending in failure. I begged him to stop, told him he had nothing to prove. But he said," her voice caught, "he said that if he couldn't give me children, the least he could do was prove he was man enough to conquer that bull." Jed's expression softened with understanding. So he wasn't trying to break the bull, he was trying to heal his own broken heart. "Yes, and I've spent 3 years hating Lucifer for taking him away from me, when the truth is that grief and pride killed my husband long before that bull ever touched him." May reached up and pressed something into Jed's calloused palm, her wedding ring, the simple gold band she'd worn like armor for 3 years. "I want you to have this. Not because I'm forgetting Robert, but because I'm finally ready to stop living in the past." Jed looked down at the ring, understanding the magnitude of what she was offering. "May, I can't." "You can, and you will," she interrupted gently. "Because when you climb on that bull's back, I want you carrying something that represents hope instead of just history. I want you to remember that some battles are worth fighting, and some risks are worth taking." Before Jed could respond, Clayton Burke's voice cut across the corral like a whip crack. "Enough sentiment, old man. Either climb on that bull or admit you're too yellow to try." The crowd stirred restlessly, some muttering agreement with Clayton's impatience, while others shot him disapproving looks. But Jed simply smiled and slipped May's ring into his shirt pocket, where it rested next to his heart. "Mr. Burke," Jed said calmly, "I appreciate your eagerness to see me get started, but I learned a long time ago that rushing into danger is the fastest way to get yourself killed." He turned back to May, and what passed between them in that moment was visible to everyone, present a look of such profound connection that even the most cynical observer could see these two wounded souls had found healing in each other. "When this is over," Jed said quietly, "assuming I'm still in one piece, there's something I'd like to ask you." May's heart raced, but before she could respond, the moment was interrupted by an unexpected sound, Lucifer snorting and pawing the ground, as if the bull himself was growing impatient with the delay. "He's ready," Jed observed. "And so am I." As Jed approached the gate, May found herself remembering the morning 3 years ago, when she'd stood in this same spot, watching her husband prepare for his fatal encounter with Lucifer. The similarities were haunting the crowd's tension, the bull's focused attention, the sense that everything was about to change forever. But there were crucial differences too. Robert had approached Lucifer with anger and determination, treating the bull like an enemy to be conquered. Jed moved with respect and caution, acknowledging the danger while refusing to be controlled by it. "Ladies and gentlemen," Sheriff Martinez called out, his voice carrying the authority of his office, "what you're about to witness has been 3 years in the making. Win or lose, I want everyone here to show proper respect for a man brave enough to face what others have only talked about." The crowd fell completely silent as Jed opened the gate and stepped into the corral with Lucifer. The bull turned to face him, every muscle tensed and ready, but instead of the immediate charge that everyone expected, something remarkable happened. Lucifer simply stood still, studying this new challenger with what appeared to be curiosity rather than rage. "Easy, boy," Jed said softly, his voice carrying clearly in the desert air. "I'm not here to hurt you, I'm here to understand you." May watched with her heart in her throat as Jed approached the massive bull with movements so slow and deliberate they seemed choreographed. Each step was a statement of intention, a promise that violence was not his goal. Clayton Burke's confident expression began to waver as he realized that this confrontation was unlike anything he'd witnessed before. The other challengers had rushed toward their moment of truth, eager to prove themselves before fear could undermine their courage. This man seemed prepared to spend all day, if necessary, building trust one careful step at a time. "What's he doing?" someone whispered from the crowd. "Something that's never been tried before," May whispered back, her voice filled with wonder and terror in equal measure. As Jed drew within touching distance of Lucifer, the bull's massive head lowered slightly, and May could swear she saw recognition in those dark eyes, not of Jed specifically, but of something Lucifer had been waiting for without knowing it. A human who approached him without aggression, without the intent to dominate. The moment stretched like a held breath, and May realized that everyone present was witnessing something far more significant than a simple challenge. They were seeing the possibility that understanding might triumph over anger, that patience could overcome pain, and that even the most broken creatures might find healing if someone cared enough to try. The moment hung, suspended like a drop of water on the edge of falling, with Jed and Lucifer regarding each other across 3 feet of desert dust and 3 years of accumulated legend. The bull's dark eyes held an intelligence that seemed almost human, and May found herself holding her breath as she watched 2 wounded creatures recognize something of themselves in each other. Then, just as Jed extended his hand toward Lucifer's massive neck, a commotion erupted from the direction of the ranch house. One of May's ranch hands, a young man named Billy Cortez, came running across the yard, waving a leather portfolio above his head like a battle flag. "Mrs. Carson!" Billy shouted, his voice cracking with urgency. "Mrs. Carson, you need to see this right now!" The spell between man and bull was broken as everyone turned toward the interruption. Lucifer snorted and stepped back, his moment of trust dissolved by the sudden noise and movement. Jed remained perfectly still, understanding that any quick motion now could trigger the violence he'd worked so carefully to avoid. "Billy, what in heaven's name?" May began, but her words died as she saw the expression on the young man's face. Billy looked like he'd seen a ghost, his skin pale and his hands shaking as he clutched the portfolio. "I was cleaning out the storage room like you asked," Billy gasped, still breathing hard from his run. "Found this hidden behind some old feed sacks. Mrs. Carson, I think you need to read what's inside." May's irritation at the interruption transformed into unease as she took the portfolio from Billy's trembling hands. The leather was expensive but worn, and she recognized it immediately as one of Robert's business folders. She'd thought she'd found and sorted through all his papers in the weeks after his death, but apparently this one had been deliberately hidden. "What is it?" Clayton Burke called out, his voice sharp with sudden interest. May's hands trembled as she opened the portfolio, and what she found inside made her legs go weak. The first document was a mortgage agreement, signed in Robert's familiar handwriting, pledging the Carson Ranch as collateral for a loan of $5,000. The date was just 2 weeks before Robert's death. But it was the second document that made May's world tilt sideways. A letter, written in Robert's own hand, addressed to her but never delivered. "My dearest May, if you are reading this, then I have failed in my attempt to ride Lucifer, and you have discovered the terrible truth I have been hiding from you. The ranch is mortgaged to Clayton Burke for gambling debts I accumulated, trying to get rich quick so I could give you the life you deserved. I know you will think me a fool, and you will be right. I borrowed money to invest in a silver mine scheme that proved to be worthless. When Burke demanded payment, I offered him the ranch as collateral, thinking I could ride Lucifer, win the prize money Burke offered for anyone who could break the bull and clear our debts. By the time you read this, I will either be dead or too broken to face the shame of what I've done to us. If I die, at least my life insurance will pay off the mortgage and leave you free. If I live, I don't know how I can ever ask your forgiveness. I love you more than my own life, which is why I'm risking it to try to fix what I've broken. Your devoted husband, Robert. May's hands shook so violently she nearly dropped the letter. The man she'd mourned for 3 years, the husband she'd idealized and grieved for, had been living a lie. Worse, his confrontation with Lucifer hadn't been about proving his manhood, it had been a desperate suicide attempt designed to clear debts she'd never known existed. May? Jed's voice came from inside the corral, gentle and concerned. What is it? Before May could answer, Clayton Burke strode forward with the predatory confidence of a man who'd been waiting 3 years for this moment. I believe that's my mortgage agreement, May. And I believe the 3 years of grace I've allowed you out of respect for your grief have just expired. The crowd murmured in confusion and growing alarm as the implications became clear. May looked up from the papers to see Clayton's triumphant smile, and she realized that he'd known about the hidden documents all along. He'd been waiting for her to discover them, using her ignorance to his advantage while courting her with false kindness. You knew, May whispered, her voice barely audible, but carrying clearly in the desert air. You've known all along that Robert owed you this ranch. Of course I knew, Clayton replied, his mask of concern finally dropping to reveal the calculating businessman beneath. I wrote the mortgage myself, but I also knew that a grieving widow deserved time to adjust to her new circumstances. Now that time is up. Sheriff Martinez stepped forward, his hand resting on his gun. Burke, if you've been defrauding this woman— There's no fraud here, Sheriff, just business. May's husband borrowed money he couldn't repay and put this ranch up as collateral. When he died, I could have foreclosed immediately, but I chose to be generous. Now May can either honor her husband's debt or accept my proposal of marriage. Either way, this ranch becomes mine. May felt the world spinning around her as the full scope of her situation became clear. Not only had Robert died for nothing, his insurance money had gone to pay off other debts she'd never known about, but she'd been living on borrowed time for 3 years without realizing it. How much? She asked quietly. $5,000 plus 3 years of accumulated interest. Call it $7,000, all told. $7,000. It might as well have been $7 million for all May's ability to raise such a sum. The ranch barely turned enough profit to keep her fed and clothed, and she had no wealthy relatives or mysterious inheritances to call upon. I don't have that kind of money, she said, her voice hollow with defeat. I know you don't, Clayton replied with false sympathy, which is why my offer of marriage remains open. Marry me, and the debt disappears. Refuse, and I'll be forced to foreclose within 30 days. From inside the corral, Jed watched this drama unfold with growing understanding and quiet fury. He'd seen May's courage and dignity, had witnessed her strength in the face of loss, and now he was watching a predator try to use her husband's deception to steal everything she'd worked to preserve. Mrs. Carson, Jed called out, his voice carrying the same calm authority that had impressed Lucifer. If I may make a suggestion. All eyes turned toward the corral, where man and bull still stood in careful proximity, the original challenge momentarily forgotten in the face of this larger crisis. The way I see it, Jed continued, you've got a couple of options here. You can let Mr. Burke's news defeat you before this challenge even takes place. Or you can remember that sometimes the biggest gambles are the ones we take on ourselves. What are you proposing? May asked, though something in her voice suggested she was beginning to understand. I'm proposing we raise the stakes. If I succeed in riding Lucifer, Mr. Burke cancels your debt in its entirety. If I fail, you marry him as planned, and I leave the territory forever. Clayton's eyes narrowed with suspicion. And what possible reason would I have to accept such terms? Jed smiled, and the expression held enough quiet confidence to make even Clayton pause. Because you've been so certain, no one can ride that bull that you've been bragging about it for 3 years. Here's your chance to prove it in front of the whole territory. If you're right, you get the woman and the ranch. If you're wrong, well, I guess that would make you a man who's been talking bigger than he can back up. The challenge hung in the air like a gauntlet thrown down, and May realized that Jed was gambling everything, her future, his own safety, and the pride of the most powerful man in the territory and his ability to do what 23 other men had failed to accomplish. Clayton looked around at the crowd, seeing in their faces the expectation that he would accept. To back down now would be to admit doubt in his own certainty, to show weakness in front of people whose respect he needed to maintain his position. "Very well," he said finally, "but I want witnesses to this agreement, and I want it understood that when you fail, old man, you'll leave this territory and never return." "Agreed," Jed replied without hesitation. As the two men shook hands across the fence, May realized that her world had just shifted on its axis once again. The simple challenge that had defined her grief for 3 years had become something far more complex, a battle for her future, her freedom, and her right to choose her own destiny. And it all rested on the shoulders of a 60-year-old drifter who was about to climb onto the back of a bull that had never been conquered. The weight of what had just transpired settled over the crowd like dust after a thunderstorm. May stood clutching Robert's hidden letter, her world rewritten in the space of a heartbeat, while Jed remained in the corral with Lucifer, now carrying the burden of not just his own redemption, but her entire future. From his shirt pocket, Jed withdrew his father's pocket watcher railroad timepiece that had stopped working the day Michael died, frozen forever, at 3:47, the exact moment when Jed's old life had ended and his wandering had begun. He'd carried it for 5 years as a reminder of time lost and chances missed, but now it felt different in his weathered hands. Now it represented the possibility that some moments were worth more than all the time that came before or after. "May," he called softly, his voice carrying across the suddenly quiet corral, "I need you to know something before this goes any further." She approached the fence, moving like a woman walking through a dream, still processing the revelation that her entire life for the past 3 years had been built on lies and borrowed time. "I've been a lot of things in my 60 years, Jed continued, his eyes never leaving Lucifer, who stood watching this human drama with the patient attention of a creature that had learned to read the intentions of men. "I've been a champion and a failure, a teacher and a student, a father and a man who lost everything that mattered to him. But I've never been a liar, and I won't start now." He turned to face her directly, and May saw in his expression a depth of feeling that took her breath away. "I can't promise you I'll succeed in there. That bull has broken better men than me, and I'm not the rider I was 20 years ago. But I can promise you this: if I fail, it won't be because I didn't give everything I had to give." May felt tears threatening, but they were different from the tears she'd shed for 3 years. These weren't tears of grief or anger, but of something far more dangerous. "Jed," she whispered, "what if?" "No," he interrupted gently. "No. What ifs? What ifs are for people who have time to waste, and we're fresh out of that particular luxury." Clayton Burke watched this exchange with growing irritation. He'd orchestrated this moment for 3 years, had waited patiently for May's desperation to overcome her stubborn independence, and now this aging drifter was threatening to upset plans that had seemed foolproof just an hour earlier. "Enough sentiment," Clayton called out. "You've made your bargain, old man. Time to honor it." The crowd stirred restlessly, their attention split between the human drama playing out at the fence and the magnificent danger of Lucifer, who seemed to sense that the moment of truth was finally approaching. Some of the spectators had begun to pray quietly, under their breath, for the safety of a man they barely knew but had come to respect. Sarah Henderson, the elderly widow whose roof Jed had repaired, spoke for many when she called out, "You show that devil what a real man can do, Jed Waller." Jed smiled at the encouragement, but his attention was focused on Lucifer. The bull had been watching the human proceedings with what appeared to be growing impatience, as if he too understood that the time for talking had passed and the time for action had arrived. "All right, boy," Jed said softly, approaching the bull with the same careful respect he'd shown from the beginning. "You and I have business to finish." As Jed moved closer to Lucifer, memories flooded through his mind like scenes from a life lived in chapters. He remembered his first bull ride at age 16, when the world had seemed full of endless possibilities, and every challenge was just another opportunity to prove himself. He remembered meeting Michael's mother, a dance hall girl with laughing eyes who died in childbirth but had given him the greatest gift of his life. He remembered the years of teaching Michael to ride, to understand animals, to be gentle with strength and patient with fear. And he remembered that terrible afternoon in Colorado when overconfidence had cost his son everything, when Michael had reached for glory and found only tragedy. But alongside these memories of loss, newer images began to emerge. May's smile when she thought no one was watching, the way her eyes had softened when she'd given him her wedding ring. The possibility that love might be stronger than grief, that understanding might triumph over anger, that some risks were worth taking regardless of the outcome. Lucifer stood perfectly still as Jed approached, his massive frame radiating power, but also something else, kind of weary resignation that spoke of too many battles fought, too many challenges accepted, too many men who had come seeking to break him rather than understand him. "You're tired of this, aren't you?" Jed said quietly, close enough now that he could have reached out and touched the bull's hide. "Tired of being treated like a monster when all you ever wanted was to be left in peace?" The bull's dark eyes fixed on Jed's face, and for a moment, man and beast seemed to communicate in a language older than words. It was the understanding between two creatures who had been shaped by pain, but had not been broken by it, who had learned that survival sometimes required striking back at a world that seemed determined to cause suffering. "I know what it's like," Jed continued, his voice so soft that even the crowd at the fence had to strain to hear. "I know what it's like to carry anger so deep it becomes part of who you are. I know what it's like to strike out at people who don't deserve it just because you're hurting too much to see straight." May watched this extraordinary conversation between man and beast, understanding that she was witnessing something unprecedented. Every other challenger had approached Lucifer as an adversary to be conquered. Jed was speaking to him as a fellow sufferer, acknowledging the bull's pain while asking for partnership rather than demanding submission. The sun had reached its zenith, beating down on the corral with the relentless intensity that made the high desert both beautiful and dangerous. Sweat beaded on Jed's forehead, but his hands remained steady as he slowly, carefully extended his right hand toward Lucifer's neck. The crowd held its collective breath as Jed's weathered fingers made contact with the bull's hide. Instead of the violent reaction everyone expected, Lucifer simply stood still, allowing this unprecedented intimacy between natural enemies. "That's it," Jed whispered. "That's the way. We're not enemies, you and I. We're just two old warriors who've been fighting the same battle from different sides." Clayton Burke's confident expression began to waver as he realized that this encounter was unlike anything he'd witnessed in 3 years of failed challenges. The other riders had approached Lucifer with bravado and aggression, treating the bull like a problem to be solved through superior force. This man was treating Lucifer like a partner in some ancient dance, seeking harmony rather than dominance. "What's he doing?" Clayton muttered, more to himself than to anyone in particular. "Something that should have been tried 3 years ago," Sheriff Martinez replied quietly. As Jed continued his gentle contact with Lucifer, he began to understand the source of the bull's pain. His careful exploration revealed old scars along the animal's ribs, evidence of spurs used too cruelly, of riders who had tried to control through pain rather than skill. There was an old injury to the bull's left shoulder, probably from a fall that had never healed properly, and the way Lucifer favored his right side suggested ongoing discomfort that would make any sudden movement painful. "They hurt you," Jed said with quiet understanding. "All those riders, all those men trying to prove themselves on your back, they hurt you, and you've been carrying that pain ever since." May felt her heart breaking as she realized the truth of what Jed was revealing. Lucifer wasn't evil or naturally violent. He was a creature in chronic pain, striking out at tormentors who kept demanding that he endure more suffering for their entertainment. "But I'm not here to hurt you," Jed continued, his voice carrying absolute sincerity. "I'm here to ask if you might be willing to help me save the woman I love. And maybe, if we can trust each other for just 8 seconds, we can both find a little peace." The bull's response was subtle but unmistakable. His massive head lowered slightly, and the rigid tension in his muscles eased just enough to suggest that he was listening, considering this unprecedented request for cooperation rather than submission. Jed felt the shift and knew that this moment, this fragile understanding between two wounded creatures, was as close to a miracle as he was ever likely to witness. Now came the ultimate test. Could trust that had taken minutes to build survive the explosive challenge of an actual ride? "All right, boy," Jed said softly, backing away just far enough to prepare for mounting. "Let's show these people what's possible when understanding meets courage." As he moved into position, Jed felt the weight of everyone's hopes and fears pressing down on him like the desert heat. May's future, his own redemption, the faith of people who had chosen to believe in something that seemed impossible of it, rested on the next 8 seconds of his life. The pocket watch in his shirt seemed to tick in rhythm with his heartbeat, marking time that had been frozen for 5 years, but was about to start moving again. Whether it moved toward triumph or tragedy remained to be seen, but Jed knew that either way, he would face the outcome with the quiet dignity of a man who had finally stopped running from his past and started fighting for his future. The moment arrived with the sudden stillness that precedes a thunderstorm. Jed positioned himself beside Lucifer's massive flank, his movements deliberate and respectful, every gesture designed to maintain the fragile trust they'd built over the past few minutes. The bull stood motionless, his dark eyes fixed on something beyond the corral's fence, as if he were seeing not just the present moment, but all the moments that had led to this point. As Jed prepared to mount, a single white feather drifted down from the cloudless sky, landing gently on Lucifer's neck like a blessing from above. May gasped, her hand flying to her throat as she remembered the story her grandmother used to tell about white feathers being messages from departed loved ones, signs that those who had passed on were watching over the living. "Robert," she whispered, and for the first time since her husband's death, the thought of him brought comfort rather than pain. Perhaps his spirit had found peace at last, and perhaps he was giving his blessing to this moment that would determine her future. Jed saw the feather but didn't pause to wonder at its significance. Instead, he used the moment of calm it seemed to bring to Lucifer as his opportunity to swing his leg over the bull's back and settle into position. His movements were fluid despite his age, muscle memory from decades of riding taking over where conscious thought might have faltered. The instant Jed's weight settled onto his back, Lucifer's entire demeanor changed. But instead of the explosive rage that had characterized his response to previous riders, the bull's reaction was measured, almost thoughtful. He shifted his weight slightly, testing the balance of this new burden, and then began to move. What followed defied everything the crowd had expected to see. Instead of the violent bucking that had become Lucifer's trademark, the bull's movements were controlled, almost dance-like. He rocked forward and back, testing Jed's seat and balance, but without the malicious intent to harm that had marked his encounters with other riders. Jed responded with equal grace, his body moving in harmony with the bull's rhythm rather than fighting against it. His left hand gripped the rope with the perfect tensions, secure enough to maintain his seat but loose enough to allow for the fluid adjustments that partnership required. His right arm moved naturally for balance, never flailing or grabbing for security that wasn't there. "My God," Sheriff Martinez breathed, his voice barely audible above the sound of the crowd's collective intake of breath. "Look at them. They're working together." May watched in wonder as man and beast found a rhythm that was both powerful and beautiful. This wasn't the brutal contest of wills she'd witnessed with previous challengers. This was something entirely different, a conversation, conducted in the language of balance and trust, a demonstration that strength could be channeled toward harmony rather than dominance. The 8-second mark that defined a successful ride came and went, almost unnoticed, but Jed made no move to dismount. Instead, he continued riding, and Lucifer continued his measured movements, as if both participants understood that this moment was about far more than meeting the technical requirements of a challenge. Clayton Burke's face had gone pale as he realized that his carefully laid plans were crumbling before his eyes. The impossible was happening, and with it, his dreams of acquiring the Carson Ranch through May's desperation were evaporating like morning dew. "This isn't over," he muttered, his hand moving instinctively toward the gun at his hip. "Even if he rides the bull, there's still the matter of the debt." "The debt was your doing, Clayton," May called out, her voice strong with newfound confidence. "And when Jed succeeds, and he will succeed, that debt dies with your arrogance." As if responding to her words, Lucifer's movements became even more fluid, more controlled. The bull seemed to understand that he was participating in something significant, something that would define not just this moment, but the future of everyone present. Jed felt the change, and knew that they had achieved something unprecedented. The bull beneath him was no longer fighting. He was performing, demonstrating power, controlled by wisdom, rather than released through rage. Together, they were proving that understanding could triumph over force, that patience could overcome anger, that even the most wounded creatures could find healing if someone cared enough to try. The crowd watched in absolute silence, understanding that they were witnessing something that would be talked about for generations. This wasn't just a successful bull ride, it was a transformation, a moment when everything everyone thought they knew about strength and dominance was being gently but firmly proven wrong. As the ride continued past its second minute, May felt tears streaming down her face, tears of joy, of relief, of love for a man who had risked everything to save her future. The wooden horse in her pocket seemed to pulse with new meaning, no longer a symbol of dreams deferred but of possibilities reborn. Lucifer's movements began to slow, becoming less like bucking and more like a ceremonial dance. The bull seemed to understand that his part in this drama was nearing its conclusion, and he was choosing to end it with dignity rather than violence. Jed sensed the change and knew that their partnership had achieved everything it could achieve. With movements as careful and respectful as those he'd used to mount, he prepared to dismount, understanding that how this moment ended would be just as important as how it had begun. With the grace of a man who had spent a lifetime understanding the rhythm of dangerous partnerships, Jed dismounted from Lucifer's back. His feet touched the ground softly, and he immediately turned to face the bull, his hand extended in a gesture of gratitude and respect. Lucifer lowered his massive head and actually nuzzled Jed's palm, a display of affection that sent gasps of amazement through the watching crowd. The beast that had been the terror of the territory for 3 years was acting like a gentle giant, transformed by an approach that had sought understanding rather than conquest. The crowd erupted in cheers that could probably be heard all the way back in Esperanza. People were hugging each other, crying, laughing, and shouting Jed's name as if he'd just performed a miracle. In a way, May thought, perhaps he had. But Clayton Burke wasn't finished. As the celebration reached its peak, he drew his pistol and pointed it directly at Jed's back. "Nobody move," Clayton shouted, his voice cutting through the jubilation like a knife. "This isn't over. I don't care if he rode that devil bull, the debt still stands, and I'll be damned if I let some aging drifter steal what's rightfully mine." The crowd fell silent, the joy of victory replaced by the cold fear of impending violence. May felt her heart stop as she saw the gun pointed at the man she loved, the man who had just proven that miracles were possible. "Clayton, put that gun away," Sheriff Martinez commanded, his own weapon appearing in his hand with practiced speed. "You're making a mistake that'll cost you everything. The only mistake was letting this charade go on as long as it has." Clayton snarled, "May belongs to me, and so does this ranch. If I have to kill this old fool to claim what's mine, so be it." But Clayton had made a crucial error in his rage and desperation. He'd forgotten about Lucifer. The bull, still standing close to Jed and newly bonded to the man who had treated him with unprecedented respect, saw the threat to his partner. With a sound like thunder rolling across the desert, Lucifer charged. Clayton spun toward the approaching bull, his gun swinging wildly, but Lucifer was already upon him. The massive animal didn't use his haunch, simply knocked Clayton down with the force of his charge, sending the gun flying across the corral to land harmlessly in the dust. Clayton lay sprawled on his back, staring up at 2,000 pounds of angry bull, and for the first time in his privileged life, he understood what it meant to be completely powerless. Lucifer stood over him, snorting and pawing the ground, his dark eyes promising that any movement would be Clayton's last. "Please," Clayton whimpered, all his arrogance gone in an instant. "Don't let him kill me." Jed approached calmly, placing a gentle hand on Lucifer's neck. "Easy, boy. He's not worth it. We've won what we came to win." At Jed's touch, Lucifer stepped back, though he kept his attention fixed on Clayton with the focused intensity of a predator watching prey. Sheriff Martinez moved in quickly, hauling Clayton to his feet and snapping handcuffs around his wrists. "Clayton Burke, you're under arrest for attempted murder, fraud, and threatening behavior. And before you start protesting your innocence, we've got about 50 witnesses who just watched you try to shoot an unarmed man in the back." "You can't arrest me," Clayton protested, some of his bluster returning now that he was no longer under Lucifer's direct threat. "I'm the most powerful man in this territory." May corrected, stepping forward with fire in her eyes and her husband's silver belt buckle in her hands. She'd retrieved it from the house during the chaos, and now she threw it into the dirt at Clayton's feet like a gauntlet. "You're nothing now, Clayton Burke. Nothing but a criminal who tried to steal a widow's ranch through lies and intimidation. And even if that mortgage was legitimate, which I doubt, given what we've learned about your character, it's worthless now. Jed met your challenge, and by the terms of your own agreement, the debt is cancelled." Clayton's face contorted with rage, but there was nothing he could do. He'd been outwitted, outfought, and outmaneuvered by people he'd considered beneath his notice. As Sheriff Martinez led Clayton away, the crowd's attention returned to the real heroes of the day. May ran into the corral and threw herself into Jed's arms, kissing him with all the passion and gratitude and love that had been building in her heart since the moment he'd first shown her a different way to see her challenges. "You did it," she whispered against his lips. "You actually did it." "We did it," Jed corrected gently. "You, me, and that magnificent bull. We proved that some things are worth fighting for, and some risks are worth taking." Lucifer stood nearby, peacefully grazing as if nothing extraordinary had happened, the white feather still caught in his mane like a blessing that would never fade. The challenge that had defined Esperanza for 3 years was finally over, but the love story that had emerged from its ashes was just beginning. 6 months later, the town square of Esperanza buzzed with an energy it hadn't known in years. Wedding decorations hung from every available post and rail, and the entire population had turned out to witness the marriage of May Carson and Jed Waller. The ceremony was simple but heartfelt, conducted by the traveling preacher who made his rounds through the territory 4 times a year. May wore her mother's wedding dress, altered to fit her figure, and carried a bouquet of desert wildflowers that Jed had picked that morning. But the most striking thing about her appearance was the radiant happiness that seemed to shine from within, transforming her from a bitter widow into a woman reborn through love and hope. Jed stood beside her, in his best clothes still, worn but clean, and pressed with the care of a man who understood the importance of occasions. His weathered hands were steady as he slipped a simple gold band onto May's finger, and his voice was strong and clear as he made promises he intended to keep for whatever time remained to them. The new brand they'd designed together was already making its mark on the territory. The combined initials, J and M, intertwined in an elegant design that spoke of partnership rather than ownership, of 2 people building something together that was stronger than what either could create alone. The Carson Ranch now, the Carson Waller Ranch was, thriving under Jed's patient management and May's renewed energy. Most remarkably, Lucifer had been transformed from the terror of the territory into its greatest attraction. Word of the unprecedented partnership between man and bull had spread far beyond New Mexico, bringing visitors from across the West who wanted to see the beast that had been tamed, not through force, but through understanding. But Lucifer wasn't being used for entertainment or challenges anymore. Instead, Jed had begun a breeding program, using the magnificent bull to sire a new generation of cattle that combined size and strength with gentler temperaments. The approach was revolutionary, treating breeding stock as partners rather than simply genetic resources, and the results were already showing promise. The bull himself seemed to have found peace in his new role. The chronic pain that had driven his rage had been treated by a veterinarian from Santa Fe, and proper care had eased the old injuries that had made every movement an agony. Lucifer spent his days grazing peacefully in green pastures, no longer the angry, isolated creature he'd been, but a patriarch, surrounded by respect and comfort. Clayton Burke's downfall had been swift and complete. Investigation into his business practices had revealed a pattern of fraud, intimidation, and illegal foreclosures that stretched back years. He was currently serving a 10-year sentence in the territorial prison, his vast holdings distributed among the people he'd cheated. The Carson Ranch's mortgage had been revealed as completely fraudulent of many fake documents Clayton had used to steal property from vulnerable widows and struggling ranchers. The wedding reception was held in Tom Brennan's saloon, which had been decorated with bunting and filled with tables groaning under the weight of food contributed by every family in the territory. There was dancing and singing, and enough joy to make up for all the sorrow the town had endured during its declining years. Sarah Henderson, now fully recovered and living in a house that no longer leaked, stood to offer a toast. "To Jed and May," she said, her elderly voice carrying clearly through the crowded room, "who proved that love is stronger than loss, that patience is stronger than anger, and that sometimes the best things in life come to those who are brave enough to believe in second chances." The crowd drank to that sentiment with enthusiasm, and as the evening wore on, May found herself thinking about the future in ways she hadn't dared to consider since Robert's death. She was 3 months pregnant, a development that had surprised both her and Jed, but filled them with quiet joy. At 36, she'd thought her chance for motherhood had passed, but life, it seemed, still had surprises in store. They'd agreed to name the child Michael if it was a boy, honoring Jed's lost son, while looking forward to the future rather than backward to grief. If it was a girl, they'd chosen Sarah, after the elderly widow who'd prayed for them both and whose faith had seemed to bless their unlikely romance. As the reception wound down and the last guests departed, May and Jed walked hand in hand back to their ranch under a canopy of stars that seemed especially bright in the clear desert air. The house that had felt too big and too empty for one grieving woman now felt exactly right for a family beginning to grow. They paused on the porch to look out over their land, watching Lucifer grazing peacefully in the moonlight. The bull looked up as if sensing their attention and gave a soft snort that might have been a greeting or a blessing. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you'd never come to Esperanza?" May asked, leaning against Jed's shoulder. "Every day," Jed replied honestly. "But then I remember that some things are meant to be, and some people are meant to find each other no matter how long the journey takes." May smiled and pulled the little wooden horse from her pocket. She'd carried it throughout the ceremony as a reminder of dreams that could be reborn. "Robert would have liked you," she said softly. "He would have been happy to know that someone who understood patience and kindness was taking care of his ranch." "And Michael would have loved you," Jed replied, his voice warm with certainty. "He always said the most important thing about a person was whether they had room in their heart for hope." They stood in comfortable silence, two people who'd found healing in each other's love, watching over a land that had been transformed from a place of grief into a symbol of new beginnings. The challenge that had once defined their community was now just a memory, replaced by the understanding that strength came not from conquest, but from connection, not from dominance, but from partnership. In the distance, the lights of Esparanza twinkled like earthbound stars, and the town that had once been dying was showing new signs of life as word spread about the couple who'd proven that love could triumph over loss, that understanding could overcome anger, and that even the most broken hearts could learn to hope again. The future stretched before them like an unwritten story, full of promise and possibility. and they faced it together with the quiet confidence of people who'd learned that the best victories weren't won through force, but earned through patience, respect, and the courage to believe that tomorrow could be better than yesterday.